Hello, all, and leaving off in our discussions of Joseph Campbell's Masks of God series in Volume 1 with primitive mythology, we're now going to turn to some of the more interesting, in my opinion, ideas in some of these dense chapters here, with chapters 2 and 3, which revolve around the Apriori, the Enigma of the inherited image, and then, of course, the imprints of experience, which is this sort of universal situations that lead way to the likes of ritual and mythology. And so, to start with part one, however, we're going to look at the psychology and the psychodynamics of what myth is in the lesson of the mask. And so, essentially, it is a discussion on how when one applies the mask in ritual, they are not just a reference to some sort of deity or some greater idea, but actually becomes that deity. They play as that deity with the mask that they have chosen. And so, this in tribal societies is the delusion of the sort of biological or ego, the idea of the self, if you would like, into the actual realm of forms of deities, of the universal ideals, if you would like. This is somewhat reminiscent of our last thinker with Jean Gebser, of course, who discussed the properties of miracles and how they could actually happen by, of course, delving down into the ever present, if you would like. And so here we are looking at how Campbell sees that other beings can see and act through as a sort of conduit, and behavior patterns or psychology in the core of the person is flattened into a 2D dimensional face space where the human subject itself is collapsed and follows into the realm of signs of archetypical forms of compressed ideas that contain historical and complex processes, as Marshall McLuhan would say. And so, of course, with myth, we have to remember that most of the myths are bards, like Homer, and so the details, the complexities, if you would like, within a historical process is pushed down into this 2D face space that Campbell really alludes here as a sort of working of myth in its psychology. It's also very reminiscent in a sort of interesting way to how Deleuze and Guattari talk about the body without organ. Campbell then gives an example of children's play or imagination, which is really spontaneous at a certain degree of, or a timeline, if you would like, within a child's life where they have this sort of spontaneous and vivid imagination going on where, as Campbell will put later, they're practicing a sort of primitive metaphysics. It's perhaps not as articulate, but there's this sort of playfulness going on where he talks about the witch and the candle conjures that, the becoming of the witch and brought forth into the playful experience is a similar way to how high culture ideas with the demons and monsters that are outside of the castle and this sort of suspension of belief. This is definitely not something for a rationalist. And again, I think of how, in the logic of sense, why would Deleuze use Lewis Carroll's character Alice in Wonderland to demonstrate how logic isn't necessarily just A and B, just like with how Alice had this paradoxical sort of sense experience going on where A very well could be B. To perhaps make this a little bit more concrete and give some depth to this, I think when we think about the social media personality, or if you know anything about professional wrestling, for example, where the lines are blurred between who this on-scene character is. And of course, this is the case with Hollywood. You have very weird examples of people becoming totally absorbed into this persona. And I think you see this a lot in a democratic, more democratized sense with the social media persona, where people really don't know who they are anymore outside of their social media postings, if you would like. And so, who is the character and who is the actual person that's wearing the mask, if you would like. And I think that is somewhat of an example in our culture today that we could reference here to really what Campbell's talking about, and this more primitive societal sense, or at least this is the closest that we could really refer to in today's world to it, that perhaps gives a sort of reference or a similarity to this traditional way in which the mask overcomes really the ego reference that the person wearing it is, and actually becomes a deity and takes on the sort of persona of it in a sense. So now we approach one of the fascinating ideas, I think, with Campbell here, and this is the enigma of the inherited image, which again is the a priori aspect of myth. And so the inherited image is primarily aligned with what we would call the instincts. And so he has these examples here in the animal kingdom where sea turtles, they come onto land rather instinctively, and then they lay these eggs, and then they, of course, return back to the sea. And when the infants hatch, they know already, without being taught, without being instructed, to, avoid seagulls, avoid these predatory patterns, if you would like. And Campbell says, of course, they don't need an abstract reasoning for this. They know already that the seagulls are dangerous. And then in another example, he talks about chicklings who, they know to run when a hawk runs overhead. But if a different species does it, or if you used a sort of a fake, if you would like, they would flee. But if you use a sort of, reversal of the pathway, if you diverge too much from the sort of instinctual patterns that seem to exist at some point in the subconscious or the unconscious. Of course, this is a very Jungian idea here. If you divert, too far away, then of course, then they won't flee, as their instincts wouldn't give the same somatic response. And so Campbell is insisting that art and myth work on the human nervous system. This is where Jung and the Jungians get these sort of biological reference to the archetypes. And so within the chicks of the anagram of the hawk, within that conscious experience of the chicklings, Campbell says that, if that hawk had gone extinct, that anagram would still be in the nervous system to be activated at, perhaps a later reference point. Perhaps the chicklings would see that same pattern or enough in, let's say, a work of art or something, or a simulation that would recreate that sort of response to the hawk. And so Campbell's asking, does art also work in this way? In a similar way, the human psyche must also have sort of pattern recognition to it in the nervous system, where these engrams will be tapped into, whether it's through art, religion. And so perhaps in myth, even, encounters in the 6 million year old lived body, or the unconscious, if you will, would perhaps produce these similar processes within our instincts. And so, again, this is how Jung references to the biological motif, binding myth and the unconscious with these engrams, and certain patterns in the right image creates the right response. And so engrams such as the infant suckling the nipple as a sort of a priori, and the infant to the human face with the covering of faces. If you, of course, in the during the mask mandates, if you would like, when if you played with a small child, of course, they could recreate the smile just simply by deducing, even though, the mouth wasn't used at all. Many times, of course, infants will or did smile back at you, regardless of whether or not your mouth was covered with, a cloth or surgical mask, whatever the case was at the time. And so, in that similar way, and of course that is very instinctual, the baby is only a few months old. In a similar way, works of art can produce this physiological response, and Campbell believes this to be that case with regards to myth and religion. And so then we move on to the sign stimuli from Nikolai Tinbergen, which is really where he cites for the supernormal stimulus. And so essentially it is the idea that there's certain butterflies or male mate butterflies that will go after female butterflies, and if you create a sort of artificial darker wing, this sort of darkness or darker version of nature, the male mates universally prefer the darker supernormal. And again, this is a sort of central nervous response better to the non-appearance in nature, which is another really key to how art works in Campbell. And the supernormal stimulus is a very old idea, I would say, because we've traced this all the way back to the Neolithic with the use of makeup among women around the eyes. So again, this supernormal idea of accentuating darker patterns in nature goes all the way back to the Neolithic period. And so that essentially is what Campbell is talking about with myth being a priori. And now he wants to look at the collective unconscious insofar that there's these universal imprints of experience that all peoples had to have gone through to really produce a psychodynamic of what myth means in an imprint of experience in an empirical way. And so these imprints are a posteriori, but nonetheless, they are universals. And so myth works in that sort of fashion and amplifies them into the ritualized. And so he turns then to, of course, the human life cycle and its stages. So no matter, again, with the localities, each being must, of course, wake up. And so you have the awareness of the rising sun, and with that, of course, the night sky. And you have the moon in the relationship to the night and the tides of the earth, which in ritual always correlated to the female menstrual. So even though they are not a priori, these empirical references, if you would like, of experience have a universal aspect to it. And then, of course, Campbell will turn to the three life stages of 0 to the end of your teenage years of a psychological dependency. You're shoveled on all of this information of your cultural norms, and then 20 to 40 is really the ascension and the start of adulthood and a mastery of a discipline or a sort of way of life or a greater understanding, if you would like. And then out of your 40s, of course, you climb out of middle age and into older age, where you inevitably have to face your death. And so, again, this is universal, even though, of course, it is localized in its experience. So, going through these, then we have these 5 constellations of imprints in the early stages of the birthing trauma. In a similar way, when one has an anxiety attack, when someone is overwhelmed, we could say that they're having a reactivation of the birthing trauma, the shortness of breath, the sort of analysis that many in the field of psychology would take towards, the birthing trauma and being stuck in different aspects, or at least their psychological makeup, their ego, if you would like. And, you could see, the man child comes to mind, or someone who is stunted. And, in many cases, it is actually a sort of reference really to the birthing trauma. And nonetheless, though, it is something that we all must go through, whether or not we have varying degrees of a sort of trauma from it. And then second, we have the experience of the mother's breast and the nourishment from it. And of course, from the sacredness of the milk, we also have to deal with the separation from it. So the separation of the nourishment creates an anxiety. And so the first two experiences that he alludes to, of course, has to do with the mother's body. The third imprint is the fascination with excrement, which of course then gets repressed and then perhaps is, reinvigorated later on in greater culture with the creation of art, or at least in the Freudian way of looking at it, of making of clay pottery, of sculptures, could reference back to learning of the excrement and its properties and really the play that comes with it. It's pretty fascinating, I would say. Then the fourth imprint is age 4 or 5. There's these differences that become more eligible really between the sexes, and the fear of castration, or with the female penis envy, which can only really be overcome when she has her own children. The sight of the vagina for the child or the man is really a trauma of, knowing that there is a sort of missing penis involved, and this could ultimately happen to him at some point. And then in the fifth example is in line with the Oedipal family structure of wanting to eliminating the aggressive father, ogre-like figure who rains down and potentially gives the punishment of castration. And of course, with the female, you have the rivalry between the mother trying to rival the attention of the father. And so the psychology of a spontaneous animism of children becomes more applicable from the ages of 6 to 12, because the child is starting to really bud as an intellectual and plays this sort of infantile metaphysician that we alluded to earlier. Where does the universe come from? These sorts of ideas of being found, who made the universe? Everything to the child is, of course, made by something else, which is in line with animism. And so everything the children usually, take up this sort of explanation of being found somewhere. Where was I found? And then he goes through an elaborate discussion of the adulthood systems put in place in traditional society, of the sentiments of the local group. And in this analysis, he talks of the Australian Aboriginal puberty ceremony, which is a transition from infancy to maturity. And the process is basically done over a few weeks, where a child is abducted from a group of men in his tribe and taken to a secluded desert where they are put through punishment, the likes of fasting, and of course the ritual of circumcision. The child's body is also smeared in blood and only actually fed blood from the men during this journey. And so you could see how these rituals here with the Aboriginals is going to mirror the examples he gave earlier. And so the imprints of experience are reactivated or re-ritualized or re-territorialized as imprints getting across the threshold of childhood to maturity. And so that the birthing trauma is reactivated, such as the reorientation from the mother's milk to then the father's blood. The nourishment of the mother can no longer save you, or the excrement is reactivated in the smearing of the blood onto the body. And then, of course, the circumcision is the punishment of the father in its initiation ritual. Now, Campbell has these very interesting observations, really, of how modern and very literate-based societies that really have these threshold rituals only embedded with learning and education, if you would like. And it doesn't really contain the same experience of the bodily transformation that we just described with the Aboriginals here. And so, in that sort of sense, you have a missing component in this modern sphere we find ourselves in. And of course, you have the stunted child man who is really dependent on different, perhaps, aspects of these rituals that he was unable to really reflect on enough to overcome them, or at least have a sort of ritual in place, or the sort of socialization to really deal with maturity and adulthood. Gruesomely, in the second phase of initiation, there is a subincision where the young is sliced and the penis wide open with a sort of flint blade, and this is really the male equivalent to the bleeding vagina to really match or neutralize in the ritual that fear of castration from the woman. And this perhaps is also really a reference within this myth here to the androgynous gods, or the perfect beings. And of course, with the story of Adam, he of course starts off as one of these and then has his rib cut out and woman is created. And of course, this goes down the line with the Plato myth of joining together as male, male, female, and female. And then you slice that in half to explain really the differences of sexes, and then it's reconstructed and ritualized out to, coming together in that sort of unity among the sexes. With the Upanishads, you have the primordial self, which was neither male or female, but ultimately out of that loneliness, there was a creation of the other pair. And so this sort of change goes through all the forms of animals in its creation. The god-like or deity split apart in its separation and creation myth, or really the multiplying in some myths of the self and the primordial being asleep under the earth, and the pole made out of flesh arises, such as with Campbell, as he alludes to as the libidino penis. And as the reference in the Aboriginal ritual, in the cutting of the penis is the red flowers, which give birth to bandicoots or Australian creatures, and then they come to the earth, and Korora comes up, but ultimately lacks the nourishment and falls back into the earth and gradually takes shape into the first human beings. So that is really at least the myth that they are demonstrating through the ritual here. And so Campbell points out as the pole growing from the skull invites a comparison in that myth to how Christ on the cross, or the world tree, which of course was grown from the skull of Adam, to give once more to the tree to ultimately crucify Christ. They're very old metaphysical ideas within myth of the sort of purity rites and the prototypes of that perfect androgynous being. And so the myth ultimately helped this threshold of the psychological necessities of, people along their journey of really their stages of life. And then we turn to old age and the death and the cycle, which of course with Jung, he says it is necessary for us to believe in the next life or to be reborn to get over this threshold of the impending death that one must face in their old age. And so, fascinating enough, Jung has always insisted that there must be some sort of reason why, we embezzle ourselves in our youth with, the forces of nature, really, of reproduction, of status seeking, of the sort of money, wealth, and fame, if you would like. But our life doesn't just, abruptly end, or at least not in a sort of tragic way. with you being cut down in the middle of your ride against nature, if you would will. But, it is in this much older state, in this life cycle where, your faculties are diminished greatly. And then you come across this threshold, really, of a sort of concern with high culture ideas and sort of reverence towards older cultural ideas of norms before. And Jung always insisted that there was probably a reason for this to happen, and this sort of concern with religiosity and the next life and the ritualization going on in the greater culture that he talks about here. So the elders in that sense are really the protectors and the gateway to the next life. And so this really sets the stage for Campbell and the rest of the book here with the two different types of primitive worship that he sees with the hunters and the planters. The hunters, of course, is weary of the animal powers. Of course, hunting accidents are always happening. Shamans could be perhaps cursing the game. And then, of course, you have the seeded earth, the planters, which Frobenius points out that there are two really distinct reactions to death. There is a sort of reverence or the feared. And so, of course, the hunter is fearful of violence, of dying in war, and death brought upon with the mythic properties of the shaman and its curses, this sort of unnatural, if you will, whereas the planters are more seated, are really of this sort of reverence for the ancestral dead, whereas with the hunters they would use giant rocks to make sure that the dead didn't come back up. Whereas, of course, with the Neolithic, the planting societies, the dead is buried, but of course the skull is dug up to be painted and re-territorialized into the actual tribe, and is, a reference really to the ancestral will, if you would like, and how that reflects with these different reactions to cultures and tribal societies is really where we're going to see the direction of the book go as he goes backwards from the planters and the hunters and works from there. So you have a sort of polarity really developing between the mystic and the mythical as we continue with chapter 3, coming up with high civilization and an analysis of the Neolithics. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video and keep looking for more Campbell videos coming up soon.